Welcome back to the daily Living Jewish class. We have been going through the laws of forbidden foods. We've spoken about originally checking eggs and everything relating to blood. We've spoken about milk and meat. We've spoken about having food sealed and kosher certifications. We've spoken about not mixing up kosher and non-kosher or putting them too close together. And more recently, we spoke about sick animals and things that people may do to it, which is not really what the Torah, not really. The Torah does say that we may not be cruel to animals. We spoke a little bit about that and the kosher implications of that. And finally, at the end of last week, we spoke about how the Torah prohibits us from making dairy bread. Since bread is typically put in the freezer or put away to be eaten with multiple meals, if you're going to make bread and it has milk in it, then you might not realize and end up eating it with your salami. So therefore, bread has to be made parov, which is neither meat nor milk, unless you have a special sign on it that shows that it's dairy bread, or if you've made a limited amount for a particular meal that you expect to end in that meal, then it is okay. If you want to bake bread and meat in the oven at the same time, we said that if they are going to be at the same time, then at least the meat should be covered. Otherwise, the meat may end up making the bread fleshik, and then you won't be able to eat that with some cream cheese. And we are up to halacha number 30. So here's an interesting one. I never heard of it, and you may have never heard of it either. But maybe Rav Moshe will be able to give us some insight over here. The Kitzur says that in preserving fruits, people typically place the fruit in a jar and cover the mouth of the jar with the bladder skin of an animal. They use animal skin to seal the jar of the fruits that they're looking to preserve. And then it's placed into a hot oven, and that's what preserves it. So care must be taken that the bladder skin be from a kosher animal, because otherwise, when you put it in the oven together, if it's a non-kosher animal or it wasn't salted or koshered, then your apricot jam might actually have some non-kosher animal flavor. So if you are using this bladder to preserve fruits, then make sure it's from a kosher animal. Moshe, you have any insights for us on that one? No. Okay, fine. But it's interesting to hear different technologies that they came up with in order to preserve food.
They used to baking cheese when they used to put in the stomach of a sheep. Correct. Because of acidity, and that's not kosher. But preserved fruit never hurt.
Okay, fine. Very good. You mentioned what I was about to mention, that when it comes to cheeses, they used to use actually the lining of the stomach, and that would act as an agent to cause the milk to turn into cheese, and that too, one would make sure that that lining came from a kosher animal. Okay, moving on to 31. Here's another whole discussion which has to do with filtered water. So it is forbidden to drink water from wells and rivers that are known to be infested with worms or insects until the water is filtered. And even if inadvertently the unfiltered water was used for cooking, it is forbidden to eat that food. Similarly, it is forbidden to soak meat in such water or to use it for rinsing any food because the worms attach themselves to the food. This was at some point quite a big halachic debate going back, I'm not sure how far back, maybe 10, 20 years. Typically, city water has already been filtered, and therefore you can open up the tap and pour yourself a cup of water and drink it. Anyhow, I don't know exactly when it was, 10 or 20 years back, where people started saying that they see that there are actually worms in city water. And therefore, halachically, if you take a cup of water and you take a cup and you fill it with water from the tap, if that water is infested, if there are worms inside of that water, then that cup that you just filled is actually not kosher. Forget about how appetizing it sounds to know that you're ingesting some worms. Even if you want to turn a blind eye if it's infested, it's not kosher. So there was a big debate about this, which takes us back to a much larger debate, which goes back about over 100 years. There's a big debate about, so when you talk about worms, it's a very interesting discussion because, 1 second. Sorry. When you talk about worms, so, I mean, when you talk about water, so there's life in water. There's maybe, the question is what level of life? So if you take a microscope, there's so much life. Now the question is, what is halachically considered a worm to be considered non-kosher? So the Shulchan Aruch speaks about if you could see it with a naked eye. Okay, so if the only way you could see the worm is by using telescopes, then that's not considered halachically not kosher. But if with the naked eye you can see that worm, then it is not kosher. Now the debate began, how do you define the naked eye? What if you're using a magnifying glass? So, or another debate was, if you could see a dot, but that dot could either be a flint, so it could either be a piece of dust, or it could be a worm. And the only way you'll know the difference is by using a magnifying glass. So is that considered something that you can see to the naked eye, that can be seen to the naked eye or not? Is it kosher or is it not kosher? So these were all the debates. I'm not going to get into the details or into the bottom line or into, I guess, the different opinions. But the bottom line is that, still a matter of different opinions. I know that some of the rabbis said there's never been an issue. Why should there suddenly be an issue now? But obviously that is not a valid approach because the situation changes. And, I remember it being said that South African water was from the best waters in the world. That I remember it being said subsequently that it's not necessarily the case anymore. So the bottom line is that if you can see worms, really, I guess it's a question for the local rabbi in that particular place. In some places, the water, the tap water, may be deemed non-kosher, and you would actually have to put it through a filter. In other places, it's fine. As far as I'm aware, water in South Africa is still considered fine. It's kosher. It's not considered infested. Although many people do like to have filters in their home. So if they have that, then it's not just covering them from a whatever other perspective, hygienic perspective, it's also helping them from a halachic perspective because that ensures that you are not drinking any worms. Back to the text. Okay. And as he said, if it is infested, then you shouldn't drink it, you shouldn't cook with it, you shouldn't wash with it because those worms might just attach themselves to the food. When filtering such water, care must be taken to filter it through a cloth that will not allow passage even for the very thinnest worms. So again, you want to, if you are filtering, you want a good filtering system. Otherwise, it's pointless. Vinegar that contains worms should not be eaten even if filtered, because even the thinnest worm of the sort that grow in vinegar will pass through any cloth, and the filtering will worsen the situation. So it is best not to filter it because the worms that develop in beverages contained in vessels are not forbidden as long as they don't become separated, meaning as long as they don't touch anything other than the water that they were born in. And through filtering, it is possible that the worms will be separated and remain on the filter and then return to the vinegar, at which point it will be not kosher. He says the best idea is to boil the vinegar and then filter it, because when you boil it first, then that stops the worms from going through the filter. So some fascinating facts about insects over here. The moment the insects die, as long as they're alive and they're in vinegar, nothing will get in their way. But the second you kill them, then the filter will work. So that's an interesting one. I wonder how it affects, how that is applied with modern filters that may have changed. Worms that grow in fruits, when still attached to the tree, are forbidden even though they do not move from place to place. So even though that worm was basically a part of the fruit. It's not like it came from outside. It's just it grew inside the fruit itself. It's still not kosher. Sometimes black spots or dots are found on fruits, beans, and legumes. This is the first stage of their breeding, and they must be cut out with deep penetration because this area is forbidden as the worm itself. So this is another super practical halacha. Many fruits need to be checked before eating them because you do not want to violate the law of, it's actually, more than one of the 613 mitzvahs. So actually eating an infested peach or fig, you may be doing more wrong than having, a little lick on some non-kosher meat, because the lick on the non-kosher meat is forbidden, but all you're getting is just a part of it, as opposed to if a fruit is infested, so then the entire worm is inside, and that halachically is much more problematic. Some fruits, as I guess this is another example where we see that being particular about the kosher dietary laws also helps us in general eat cleaner and safer, like we spoke about earlier in the context of checking the lungs of the animals. So this comes up as well if you're in a home where you are particular about kosher, you'll be checking all fruits that might have worms inside of them, and you won't be ingesting any of that. I'm reminded of a joke. It's a terrible joke. I really shouldn't share it on this platform. But once I'm reminded of it, I guess I won't be able to resist. So if you don't like really awful jokes, then maybe just turn up your speaker for the next 30 seconds, and then I'll put my finger up once I'm done. But the joke goes like this: what's worse than finding a worm in your apple? And the answer is finding half a worm in your apple. Anyhow, the joke's done, and now back to some serious stuff, some learning. Some fruits have worms when still attached to the tree. If 12 months have passed from the time they were picked, they may be eaten. So this obviously relates to dried fruit. Now, we're not saying that insects that come to dried fruit is fine. We're saying that if the worm had been in the fruit originally and then the fruit was dried, then after 12 months, I guess the insect begins to become disintegrated, and once it becomes disintegrated, it is possibly no longer a problem. Because any creature that does not have a vertebra cannot exist more than 12 months and have therefore become like mere dust. However, since it is possible that the fruit became wormy after being picked, it should be examined and cleaned from all the worms and insects found upon the surface. So if you have in your pantry any worms, then from a halachic perspective, if not from any other perspective, you really want to just, whatever is not properly sealed, you really want to just throw out, because that's a real problem. Afterwards, they should be placed in cold water, and the water should be thoroughly stirred. So if you do a course to become a mashgiach, to work for the Beis Din in a restaurant, the Beis Din has a specific protocol as how to wash every type of fruit and vegetable to ensure that you get any worms out. And each particular fruit and vegetable has its own criteria. But it's not just that you're becoming a mashgiach, it's really for every person with a kosher kitchen to know. As the worms and worm-eaten particles rise to the surface, they should be thrown away. That's if you're rinsing it. The rest should be placed into boiling water so that if any worms remain, they will die immediately and will not become separated from the fruit. This procedure may be relied upon only in the cases of legumes or lentils and the like, and then only after the expiration of 12 months. Bottom line is, in today's day and age, just throw it out and give it away. Okay, a little more on the subject of worms. All fruits that require examination must be opened one by one and the pits removed and discarded in order that the examination is thorough. Great care must be taken regarding this when preserving fruits in honey and sugar, and similarly when making lekfer, which is prune jam. It is not sufficient to examine only a portion of the fruit, and even if the greater portion was examined, it's not efficient, but rather each fruit must be examined separately. So as long as there's concern that there might be worms, then you should be opening up every fruit. And certainly that's today when you buy a box of certain fruits. Didn't look up an exact list now, so I don't want to mislead anybody, but I think one of the examples are apricots. If you have a box of apricots, at least what I do is before I eat any apricot, I just split it open, take out the pit, give an inside inspection, check there are no worms, and only then proceed to eat it. What about flour? So flour or similar ground substances occasionally have large worms, and it is sufficient to sift the flour because the worms will not pass through. But if it is infested with mites, sifting is of no avail, and it should be discarded. So if your flour has become infested, then it's not going to help to sift it. If you're just worried about it hasn't been infested, but you're worried about one or two worms here and there, then sifting does it. If you have wheat that is infested with worms, consult the rabbinic authority as how it should be ground. So before you've even ground the wheat, you're actually a farmer and you have a silo filled with, 1,000 kilos, what do they call that? A ton of wheat, and there's some worms inside. Get in touch with your local Orthodox rabbi. As far as flour, so either you can buy from kosher you can buy from kosher stores, outlets, you can buy sifted flour. Otherwise, you should sift flour, and once it's sifted, you put it in the fridge. That's at least what we do. It'll contain in the fridge, and the fridge hopefully is a zone, no worm zone. Okay, anything which is infested with worms and is something that not usually examined for worms is forbidden to be sold even to a non-Jew, where there is a likelihood that the non-Jew might resell it to a Jew. So you really want to make sure that the Jew is not going to end up eating worms. This is a real horrible prohibition, and you don't want to cause somebody to sin without even knowing it. It may be used, however, in the making of whiskey, and we are not afraid that it will cause a problem of someone eating it in its present state, provided it is not kept for a long time. So this is an interesting discussion. The prohibition against eating worms is a whole worm, or if you can taste the worm. But if the worm is already crushed, it's broken, and it's not detectable, I'm sorry, I know it might not be all that appetizing, but this too is the wisdom of Hashem. And if we look at it from that perspective, then we're nourishing our neshama. Anyhow, so talking about
tequila.
Sorry?
What about the tequila?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not expert. I'm no expert, but as long as the worms are giving flavor to any food or drink, then the food or drink is definitely not kosher. Okay. If they're not giving any flavor, which usually is the case, usually when you're dealing with typically when we worry about worms, we're not worried about the taste. Usually they're small enough that you cannot taste them. So again, if it's larger worms that may give taste, then that itself renders the food not kosher. If they're small worms that don't give taste, then if they are complete or detectable, then they render the food not kosher. But if they have been crushed and they are not detectable anymore, and they don't give taste, those three criteria. So again, they're incomplete, you don't see it, and you don't taste it, then it does not render the food not kosher. So in the case that he just spoke about, which was whiskey, if there was some barley that had kernels that were being made into whiskey, so in order for it to be made into whiskey, everything is completely grinded. Since it's completely ground maybe, either way, it no longer becomes a problem. So that's an interesting phenomena. This also relates to another interesting example is if you want to buy a bottle of fruit juice from the store. So how do you know? Is the factory inspecting all of those fruit before they make it into juice? No, there isn't a mashgiach opening up every fruit and checking for worms. But since it's completely crushed, and so the worms, any worms that were there would be completely not detectable and give no taste, you are allowed to go ahead and drink that juice. At the outset, you're not allowed to go ahead and crush it, but if it was done, you could drink it. We'll stop over here. I see we've gone over 5:20. Thanks so much for joining. Let me actually take a quick look, just before I close, at what we have left. So we're mostly done, because I want to start on another topic tomorrow. I guess I'll just wrap it up tomorrow, and then we'll move on to I think maybe even the very end of this very long chapter on forbidden foods. Thanks so much for joining.